Hey everyone, welcome. We're tackling a topic that's been hard to ignore lately, the U.S. debt crisis.
Yeah, it's one of those things you hear about, but it's easy to feel kind of lost in the weeds with it.
Totally. But we found an article that breaks it down in a way that makes sense. It covers how we got here, how big this thing really is, and what it means for all of us, basically.
Yeah, because it impacts everyone.
Right.
So,
Absolutely. And I think what I appreciate about this article is, it doesn't just throw around these big economic terms, they actually put it in perspective.
right, like they started with that statistic, back in 1980, the national debt per U.S. household, it was about $39,000.
Okay, yeah, I remember reading that.
Big number. But fast forward to today, 2024,
Mhm.
and it's ballooned. It's over $260,000 per household.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that puts it in perspective. So back then, it's like what? Maybe buying a decent used car?
Something like that. But now we're talking a luxury car payment for every single household
Mhm.
just to cover the national debt.
Wow. And it's not just a theoretical thing, right? That's actual money that, we're all on the hook for in a way.
And the article breaks it down even further, talking about the debt per child. It's almost $500,000 per child in the U.S. So this isn't some abstract number, it has real consequences.
Okay, so we've established the debt is massive. But what does that mean for, like, our everyday lives? What are the consequences beyond just these big numbers?
Well, the article hits on two main consequences. First, just the cost of servicing the debt. We're talking over $1 trillion annually, and that's just on interest payments.
A trillion. That's more than the defense budget, isn't it?
It is. Imagine if we could redirect those funds, invest in other areas.
Yeah, pay down the actual debt, maybe.
hmm
But it feels like we're just stuck in this cycle of paying the interest and never really making a dent.
It's a real concern. And then there's this other thing that the article talks about, the debt-to-GDP ratio. Have you heard of that?
I feel like I should know what that is, but maybe you can give me a refresher.
Yeah, so basically, it's comparing how much a country owes to how much it produces in a year.
Okay, so like a measure of a country's financial health.
Exactly. A healthy ratio is usually below 60%. A country produces way more than it owes.
And I'm guessing we're not quite there?
Not quite. We're sitting at a debt-to-GDP ratio over 120%. That means the U.S. owes more than it produces in a year.
Wow, that's not great.
No, it's higher than at any other point in U.S. history, even higher than during World War II. And back then, we had a pretty good reason for all that debt.
Yeah, that was a slightly different situation. But okay, so we're in the red. And the article goes on to talk about these global implications, like this potential domino effect. So what happens if the U.S. can't actually pay its debts?
Although it wouldn't be good, that's for sure. Imagine this. The U.S., the bedrock of the global financial system, can't make good on its promises. It'd be chaos.
So like a massive run on the bank, but instead of people, it's entire countries.
Exactly. Because if the U.S. defaults, investors globally lose faith in U.S. bonds, which are usually seen as a really safe investment. And it wouldn't just impact America. Think about it, China, Japan, they hold a lot of U.S. debt.
Yeah, a default would have ripple effects all over.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how big this problem is and how high the stakes are. So what can we do about it? What are some solutions?
Well, the article goes into a few potential paths, but none of them are easy. They all have their challenges.
Yeah, I bet there's no silver bullet for this one.
The first, and probably the most ideal scenario, is good old economic growth. If the economy's booming, more tax revenue comes in, and then you can start to chip away at the debt.
That makes sense, but it's not exactly easy to just conjure up that kind of growth, is it?
No, it's definitely easier said than done, especially in today's world where everything feels so uncertain.
Right. So what are some of the other options on the table?
Well, one option the article mentioned is the government could just print more money to pay off the debt.
Okay. That sounds a little too easy, though. What's the catch?
The catch is hyperinflation.
And forgive my economics 101 here, but remind me what that means again.
Basically, if you flood the market with more money, each dollar becomes worth less. We're talking prices skyrocketing on everything. Your morning coffee could cost $20.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not good.
You could decimate the value of the dollar, make it impossible to afford basic necessities, and it would wipe out savings, investments. Not a pretty picture.
Definitely not a sustainable solution. So what else is there?
Well, that brings us to the two solutions that always seem to be at the heart of political debates: raising taxes and cutting spending.
Ah, yes, the classic. It's like picking between, I don't know, broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Neither one is exactly a crowd favorite.
Right, exactly. And the article points out that raising taxes, while it could definitely bring in more revenue, it can also backfire.
How so?
Well, if people have less money in their pockets because of higher taxes, they're going to spend less. And that can actually slow down the economy.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not as simple as just, okay, more taxes, problem solved.
Right. It's a balancing act for sure. And then, of course, there's cutting spending, which always sounds good in theory.
Until you start talking about specific.
Exactly. Because then it becomes about, whose programs get cut, what gets deemed essential. It's tricky.
Yeah, one person's wasteful spending is another person's essential program. But this article did mention something interesting about the potential for cutting back on wasted spending, right? Like they said something about, what was it?
There was a range they gave, something like $250 billion to $1 trillion in potential wasted spending every year.
Yes, that's the one. $1 trillion. That's a massive amount of money. I mean, even at the lower end, $250 billion, that's still huge.
It really highlights how crucial it is to make sure that government spending is actually efficient and effective.
Right. Like, where's all that money even going? I have to admit, I'm really curious about that now. What are some examples of this wasteful spending?
Well, you have to remember that what one person considers wasteful might be another person's priority. But some common examples that are often brought up include things like duplicative government programs.
Oh, right. Like where you have multiple agencies basically doing the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So streamlining those programs, getting rid of that redundancy, that could potentially save a lot of money.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What else?
Another thing is just inefficient bureaucracy, outdated systems, too much red tape, paperwork, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, tell me about it. I feel like I've spent a lifetime navigating bureaucracy.
It can definitely feel that way. And then there are things like subsidies and tax breaks that were maybe created with good intentions, but now they're not really serving their original purpose anymore.
So they might be outdated, or maybe they're benefiting industries that don't really need that kind of help anymore.
Exactly. And I think, it's not about just slashing everything, but it's about taking a hard look and saying, okay, is this still effective? Is this still relevant?
Right. It's about being smart with the money, not just making cuts for the sake of making cuts. So if we could actually identify and address that wasted spending, could that make a real difference in tackling the debt?
It would definitely be a step in the right direction. And the good news is, there are organizations, think tanks that focus specifically on this kind of analysis.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So they're out there looking for these inefficiencies and then suggesting ways to improve things.
Yeah, exactly. And their reports and findings can be really eye-opening, actually.
Wow, okay. It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by all of this, but just knowing that there are people out there doing that work and that there are concrete steps that can be taken, that does give me a little bit of hope.
I think that's important to remember that it's not hopeless. It's a big challenge, but it's not insurmountable. And it's something that we can all be a part of addressing.
Right. It's about working together, not just pointing fingers. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the problem. We've talked about some potential solutions, some of them more appealing than others, obviously. But what about us? What can everyday people actually do to make a difference here? Besides, maybe starting a separate savings account for that $260,000 of national debt we're all carrying around.
Well, for one thing, I think just becoming more informed about the issue, like you're doing right now by, even just listening to this deep dive.
Right, doing your research.
Exactly. The more you understand about it, the more you can have informed conversations, the more you can hold your elected officials accountable for making responsible decisions.
So it's about being an informed voter, an engaged citizen.
Absolutely. Because this isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. This is about our future. It's about the future generations are going to inherit.
It's about the kind of world we want to live in and the kind of world we want to leave behind. It really puts it all in perspective. And, going back to those solutions, especially that idea of cutting spending, it makes me think about that statistic we talked about earlier, that $250 billion to $1 trillion in potential wasted government spending.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge chunk of change. And it really makes you wonder, like, what exactly is considered wasteful spending? Where is all that money actually going?
Well, it's important to remember that the idea of waste is going to look different to different people depending on their priorities. But some things that are often brought up are like duplicative government programs.
Right, like where you have different agencies doing the same thing.
Exactly. So you can streamline those programs, eliminate redundancies. That alone could save a lot.
Yeah, that makes sense. What else?
Another big one is just inefficient bureaucracy in general. Outdated systems, unnecessary paperwork, that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Been there.
Right. And then there's things like subsidies and tax breaks that, maybe made sense at one point, but aren't really relevant anymore.
So they're either outdated or maybe they're propping up industries that don't need it anymore.
Exactly. And again, it doesn't have to be about making these huge cuts across the board,
Yeah.
but just taking a closer look and saying, is this still effective? Is this still the best use of resources?
Right, being more strategic about it. So if we could actually get a handle on that wasteful spending, could that make a significant dent in the debt?
It would definitely be a positive step. And the good news is, there are actually organizations out there whose whole job is to dig into this stuff.
Oh, really? Like what? Tell me more.
Well, there are think tanks, for example, that do really in-depth analysis of government spending, looking for inefficiencies and recommending solutions.
That's amazing. I had no idea. Are there any specific ones you recommend checking out?
Absolutely. A great place to start is the Government Accountability Office website.
Hmm.
They're nonpartisan, and they put out a ton of reports on government spending.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to have to look into that. This has been such an informative conversation, but I have to admit it can feel a bit overwhelming at times.
It's a big issue, but I think just starting to understand it is huge.
Right, knowledge is power.
Exactly. The more we know about this, the better equipped we are to have these conversations,
Hmm.
to hold our leaders accountable, to push for solutions.
To be engaged citizens, right?
Yeah,
It's not just about being passive bystanders in all of this.
exactly. This affects all of us.
Well said. And on that note, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the U.S. debt crisis.
A lot to think about.
Definitely. But we hope you learned something new today, and most importantly, that you feel empowered to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us.